The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 reshaped the geopolitical landscape, marking the end of the Cold War. A confluence of internal weaknesses and external pressures brought about the downfall of this once mighty empire. This essay will examine the key factors that contributed to the Soviet Union's demise. The Soviet Union, formerly known as the USSR, was a vast nation stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Despite its initial successes, the Soviet system was inherently flawed. By the 1980s, economic stagnation, political repression, and growing disillusionment created fertile ground for discontent. Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership in 1985, inheriting a stagnant economy and a demoralized populace. He embarked on ambitious reforms known as AND. These reforms, intended to revitalize the Soviet system, ultimately proved to be its undoing. They unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not control, leading to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union grappled with deep-seated internal problems long before its collapse. The command economy, initially successful, proved inefficient and unresponsive to the people's needs. Centralized planning led to chronic shortages of consumer goods, forcing citizens to endure long lines. The emphasis on heavy industry and military production came at the expense of consumer goods, leading to widespread dissatisfaction. The Communist Party's monopoly on power stifled dissent and bred a culture of complacency among the elite. Political repression was widespread, with dissidents silenced and basic freedoms curtailed. The Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989 further exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet system. This costly conflict drained resources, demoralized the military, and fueled public discontent. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party, ushering in a period of unprecedented reform. His twin policies of restructuring and openness aimed to revitalize the Soviet system. However, these reforms had unintended consequences that hastened the Soviet Union's demise. Aimed to introduce market economics into the Soviet system, decentralize decision-making, and boost productivity. However, the reforms were often implemented haphazardly, leading to economic disruption and confusion. The sudden shift to a more market-oriented system created chaos and exacerbated existing shortages, aimed to create a more transparent and accountable government, encouraging greater freedom of expression. However, it also unleashed long-suppressed grievances and nationalist sentiments. With repression lifted, the Soviet Union's various republics began to assert their own identities and aspirations for independence. While internal weaknesses tore the Soviet Union apart, external pressures also played a significant role in its downfall. The Soviet Union faced a renewed arms race with the United States under President Ronald Reagan. The Reagan administration's military buildup and support for anti-communist movements strained Soviet resources. The Soviet-Afghan War further weakened the Soviet Union's standing on the world stage. The eventual Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 was seen as a humiliating defeat. The symbolic collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked a turning point in the Cold War. With the Soviet Union unwilling to use force to maintain its grip, the Soviet bloc crumbled rapidly. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 reshaped the global order, marking the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's disintegration was the result of a complex interplay of internal and external factors. Decades of economic stagnation, political repression, and disillusionment created fertile ground for discontent. Gorbachev's reforms, though intended to save the Soviet system, hastened its demise and unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not control, empowering nationalist movements. The Soviet Union's internal weaknesses, coupled with external pressures, proved too much for the empire to bear. The collapse led to the emergence of 15 new independent states, each grappling with new challenges. The Soviet Union's demise serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the unintended consequences of